And the Koreans are really good at manufacturing and making it more efficient, more cost-effective, and doing it faster. And we apparently used to be a country who made ships. We no longer are. But South Korea is a global leaders.
요즘 미국 의회와 정부 보고서에서 한국을 언급하는 방식이 정말 신기할 정도로 달라졌습니다. 미국이 자기들의 산업을 다시 세우기 위해 한국의 실력을 절실하게 필요로 하는 모습인데요. 현재에서는 구체적으로 어떤 이야기가 나오고 있는지 바로 확인해 보겠습니다.
Committed $200 billion for key and emerging technologies, things like AI, quantum, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, things that are in our mutual best interests. And it's interesting to me because I've always thought Korea and the U.S. are complementary economies. We're good in technology, we develop things, and the Koreans are really good at manufacturing and making it more efficient, more cost-effective, and doing it faster. And we apparently used to be a country who made ships. We no longer are. But South Korea and Japan are global leaders. And so that commitment to help us is much appreciated. In the agreement that the U.S. and Korea made, Korea got a line in there that I think my Japanese friends wish they had gotten in their agreement as well. The Korean deal says the projects must be commercially viable. Now, the Indians who did their deal after the Japanese and the Koreans, they got another line that I think everybody wishes they had, and that was that if the situation on tariffs changes, we reserve the right to go back and renegotiate everything. But for now, I think Korea's they're committed to honoring the agreement. And I'd also like to point out that before President Trump, South Korea was already doing hugely significant investments in the U.S. The U.S. only has 3 free trade agreements in Asia. We have one with Singapore, we have one with Australia, and our newest in Asia, South Korea. South Korea went into force, 2012? And before the Chorus Agreement, it was a constant battle with Korea to get them to honor the agreements that they.
미국이 기술을 설계하고 개발하는 데 강점이 있다면 우리 한국인은 그걸 실제 제품으로 빠르게 구현해내는 능력이 세계 최고라는 평가입니다. 특히 배를 만드는 조선 분야는 미국이 예전에는 잘했지만 지금은 많이 놓쳐버린 영역인데 우리가 그 자리를 완벽하게 메워주고 있는 셈이죠. 무조건적인 도움보다는 비즈니스적으로 실속을 챙기는 모습까지 인정받고 있습니다. 미국이 아시아에서 맺은 몇 안 되는 자유무역 협정 파트너라는 사실이 우리가 가진 전략적 위치를 잘 보여줍니다.
Some of the key facts to keep in mind, Korean companies have been among the largest sources of investment in the United States. That very clearly aligns with U.S. administration priorities. So how do you think about this tension and how does it align with the report's key theme around how the private sector really is going to be the main actor trying to advance the economic security cooperation in very pragmatic terms?
Well, thanks, Emily, and thank you, Tammy and James, for being here today. And Tammy, as the oldest of 3 girls, I sympathize with your sister's struggles. So I think for us, the starting point in our report was just a frank acknowledgement that we have seen a lot of interest in cooperating on economic security issues at the government-to-government level. Like James mentioned, there were a whole plethora of initiatives and frameworks, and dialogues, both at the bilateral and the multilateral level, that we've seen the 2 parties try to stand up. They've struggled to gain traction and proven to not really be durable amid various shifts in domestic politics that we've seen, both in the U.S. and South Korea. However, and like Tammy mentioned as well, we've seen for just before the current environment that there's been a huge amount of activity going on at the private sector level, and that's proven to be really, really durable. We've continued to see massive amounts of investment from Korean companies. We've continued to see Korean and American firms form supply chain agreements and partnerships in a variety of strategic sectors. And what we noticed when writing the report was the reason for this was there's a strong commercial logic pulling the 2 sides together that's frankly not been altered by some of these tensions we've seen at the bilateral level or domestic political shifts. Like Tammy mentioned, the U.S. and South Korean economies are very complementary. We've also seen Korean firms are very interested in building resilient supply chains, and they're also looking for new markets as Chinese firms are encroaching on their market share and eroding their competitive advantage in segments in strategic sectors like shipbuilding, semiconductors, and batteries, where the U.S. is trying to build out industrial capacity.
정치적인 약속은 정권이 바뀌면 흔들리기 쉽지만 기업들이 맺은 실무적인 협력은 훨씬 끈질기고 강력합니다. 서로에게 진짜 이익이 된다는 계산이 끝났기 때문이죠. 미국은 산업 경쟁력을 다시 키우고 싶어하고 우리 기업들은 그 틈을 타서 새로운 시장을 열고 있습니다. 결국 실력과 실리라는 가장 확실한 고리로 묶여 있는 겁니다.
So in batteries and semiconductors, for example, Korean companies have already invested billions of dollars in the U.S., partially as a result of industrial policies such as the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which we might get to later today. We've seen, in AI, we've seen American tech companies like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, and Google form partnerships with companies like Kakao, SK Telecom to develop AI services and partner on developing AI infrastructure. And in shipbuilding, we've also seen a variety of activity going on between some of the major Korean shipbuilding conglomerates like Hanwha, Samsung, and Hyundai, and American firms. We didn't see a similar level of private sector activity going on in some of those other areas that you mentioned, like quantum and biotech. At least when we were writing the report, we're certainly not discouraging cooperation in those areas. We're just saying that in that
Low-hanging fruit.
Low-hanging fruit, and in those areas, it's still very much at the government-to-government level.
Thank you, Eleanor. So I want to dive a little bit deeper on the trade and the investment issues separately. We've all touched on that already. But James, let me come to you on just tell us a little bit more about how the Korean side is looking at the U.S. tariff approach. We had chorus in place. One might make the argument that everything the U.S. is currently doing is completely in violation of its obligations.
That argument would be correct.
Yes.
We are in violation of the Chorus Free Trade Agreement.
Sure. Certainly part of a, I think, broader trend in this administration moving away from rules-based trade and really trying to get to managed trade or kind of results-oriented trade rules as kind of a nice to have but not a must to have. I don't know, however you want to put that. Tammy probably has something more direct to say about that. But just tell us a little bit more about how you're seeing the influence of the tariffs in particular impacting the relationship and the private sector cooperation that we want to see.
So from a purely legal standpoint, I think, Tammy Tammy's right. But Tammy also previously said the logic here, the strategic thinking in Korea is South Korea the only country that's getting tariff at this rate? And does it unfairly disadvantage their trade?
배터리부터 반도체, 조선까지 미국이 다시 살리고 싶어하는 핵심 산업 명단에는 항상 우리 기업들의 이름이 들어 있습니다. 이건 그냥 하는 칭찬이 아닙니다. 실제 돈과 공장, 사람이 움직이는 현장에서 한국 없이는 사업 설계 자체가 안 된다는 뜻이거든요. 미국이 하나하나 이름을 부르는 기업들이 바로 우리의 진짜 경쟁력입니다.
Tammy, I want to turn to you on the investment questions. Obviously, investment commitments on the part of South Korea were a really important part of getting the reciprocal trade agreement or framework over the finish line. Even after that was some turbulence with the president here not being satisfied with how quickly Korea was moving to implement. That now seems to have subsided a bit. There seems to be a game plan to move forward, but we've not seen any specific announcements, unlike what we've seen with Japan, where clearly they've tried to put deals forward relatively quickly. There will also be potentially some hurdles here in the US market. We haven't talked about it yet, but of course, I'm sure on the back of everybody's mind is the ICE raid on the Hyundai LG plant in Georgia that really was shocking in many ways. You have the IRA history, right? So there's problems in the US market as well. So what do you see as the path forward for the investment component of the deal?
Well, first, I think the Koreans are very serious about the commitments that they've made. They're a democracy, and they're talking about using $350 billion of taxpayer money. So they went to their National Assembly, their legislature, and created a law. There's a new corporation that will come to life on June 18th. And that's when I think we're going to see the first big announcement from Korea. And we were chatting earlier, the two projects that are getting the most press, one would probably be building an LNG export facility in Louisiana, my home state, and then another one would be building a nuclear reactor. And again, Korea, I can't echo this enough, that they were already making significant investments here, whether it's Samsung or SK Hynix for semiconductors, or Hyundai Kia for autos, or LG and SK On and Samsung for batteries. It was all across Korea Inc. I think you mentioned in 2023 and 2024, South Korea was the largest foreign investor in the United States. So they were already.
특히 우리가 누군가의 부탁을 들어주러 미국에 간 게 아니라는 점에 주목해야 합니다. 우리 기업들이 스스로의 선택과 실력으로 시장을 넓혀갔고 그 결과 최근 몇 년 사이 미국 내에서 가장 큰 외국인 투자자로 기록됐습니다. 미국의 자본과 시장 그리고 우리의 기술력이 만나서 가장 효율적인 결과물을 만들어내고 있는 현장입니다.
We're big. We've got scale. We've got energy, innovation, capital markets, and advanced services. So I think there's a natural, again, complementarity. If y'all haven't read her report, and Jeff's, congratulations, Daddy, you should read it. It's excellent, very well done. And again, when I read the four sectors you were focusing on, I'm like, absolutely. Those are the ones where we're going to see the first easiest progress, and we then start building on it. And again, there are, since the Korean War is really when our economies became intertwined. My Korean friends always say, "Oh, why we don't hear big announcements about the U.S. investing in Korea, but Hyundai, is buying $36 billion of Boeing planes and GE engines, and why aren't you investing more in Korea?" And I laugh and go, because for the last 40 years, we've already been doing it. Most major American companies are already in Korea and have been there for decades. So we're already there. But now we're seeing the Korean side match that here. And I do worry a little bit that my Korean friends will worry about a hollowing out in Korea, although I don't think it will prove to be true, because Korean companies are very smart. And frankly, I bought Korean blue chip stocks in the late 80s and early 90s. And thank you, Hyundai and SK.
더 놀라운 건 설비만 옮겨온 게 아니라는 점입니다. 미국에는 없는 공장을 짓고 운영하는 노하우 자체를 우리 사람들이 직접 가서 가르치고 있습니다. 비싼 비행기 값을 들여 전문가를 보내는 이유는 그 기술이 현재 미국이 갖지 못한 핵심 능력이기 때문입니다. 우리 한국인의 성실함과 기술력이 미국의 일자리와 산업 환경까지 통째로 바꾸고 있습니다.
I want you to weigh in on the investment environment here, particularly through the lens of how this U.S. administration has really shifted strongly away from the friendshoring idea, the recognition that we can't rebuild supply chains or make supply chains resilient all by our own, to an emphasis on trying to do that, really focusing on reshoring and building up U.S. manufacturing capability. What did you find in the report on that dynamic?
Yeah, to be honest, it was a tension that we kind of kept coming back to in the report. And we didn't necessarily settle on a clean answer to it, because there frankly isn't one. We just tried to provide a framework to help policymakers think through it. So we specifically thought that first, we want to encourage onshoring, perhaps in areas where our needs are frankly probably the greatest. So shipbuilding is a great example of that, where we just won't be able to meet our urgent needs for naval vessels and commercial shipbuilding capacity without the support of Korean expertise. We also, second, we wanted to we suggested that policymakers should make sure that we're not essentially just replacing dependency on one partner with dependency on another. So we want to essentially make sure we're not substituting reliance on Chinese supply chains for reliance on Korean supply chains. However, there's a tension there in that we have to also make sure that Korean firms see a long-term interest from the US side. And then third and finally, our thought was that we also wanted, there might just be sectors potentially in shipbuilding and sectors that have some critical national security implications where offshoring and might be a little less advisable, but yeah.
One other point I want to add about the investment is that I think the government, the U.S. government and the Korean companies both need to do a better job communicating to the general American public about the benefits of these investments. I say that because I was on a panel in Atlanta 3 days after the ICE raid. The World Affairs Council had invited me, and I wasn't planning on talking about immigration, but of course that was all anyone wanted to talk about. And I was shocked that a Georgia reporter asked me, why are Koreans coming and stealing our jobs? And I chuckled and said, you really misunderstand what's happening here. First of all, the cost of an air flight from Incheon to Atlanta round trip is about $1,800. They're not sending people over here to pour concrete. These are electrical engineers. These are equipment specialists. These are people who know how to build EV battery plants, a skill that the U.S. doesn't have. But you know what? We will have it. They're teaching us. And when we get this plant, this joint venture plant between LG and Hyundai finished, then we can realize the 6,800 American jobs.
물론 중국이라는 까다로운 변수가 있습니다. 하지만 우리는 무조건 관계를 끊기보다 위험은 줄이면서도 시장의 크기는 유지하는 영리한 전략을 짜고 있습니다. 안보와 산업이라는 두 가지 어려운 숙제를 풀기 위해 치열하게 고민하는 과정이 그대로 드러납니다.
China's dominance in growing market share in critical sectors, the possibility of economic coercion. Yet the two sides approach the China question quite differently. And so how are you, and I should also note that the US approach is fluid right now, right? Like there was clearly a buildup of several years towards this strategic competition framing, kind of the steady drumbeat of competitive actions, export controls, investment screening, and the like that the United States was pushing that we're not really doing right now, right? You saw in the most recent summit between Trump and Xi this shift to the framework of strategic stability. And so how is Korea looking at US policy towards China on economic security issues, and how is that impacting their own thinking on their own economic security and how they think about the possibility of cooperating with the United States?
Right. So I think when President Lee Jae-myung came in, one of his stated objectives was to stabilize the relationship between Korea and China. There hasn't been a visit by a president from Korea to China since 2019. He was just there earlier this year. There was before that a summit between President Xi and President Lee at the sidelines of APEC. And that's fairly good from a diplomatic standpoint. A lot of positive signals being sent both ways. But Korea is also working with the United States on some issues that Beijing might not necessarily be happy about. For instance, there's discussions about nuclear submarine. There's discussions about defense industrial cooperation. So he's threading a very, very, it's a very narrow needle. And there's a potential here that that one bad move, or even for that matter, an unpredictable move by President Trump here could potentially negatively impact South Korea's relations with China. We saw an example of that with the Section 301 on port fees, where the Chinese government put sanctions on South Korean company subsidiaries that were involved in that process, and Hanwha, and all of the Hanwha subsidiaries had been sanctioned, and that's now on hold after the 301's been pulled back, but that sent a chilling effect and signaled to the other Korean companies that this is something that the Chinese government can do vis-a-vis Korea. Critical minerals, we haven't seen a lockdown there yet on Korea, but you already see what China can do to not only the United States, but countries like the neighboring country like Japan. So I think that the Koreans have to figure out if they're going to stabilize relations with China, how do you do that while maintaining the relationship with the United States and Japan? It's a difficult balance, I think.
Yeah.
Koreans have been very, very successful on building civil nuclear reactors and also ships in Korea is because the real estate is small. And the suppliers are very tightly, placed, clustered around these major manufacturing centers. And if they need parts or they need labor, they could just make a phone call and they're there the next day. So there's no bottlenecking at any of the construction and the manufacturing process. But that condition doesn't hold here for shipbuilding and for nuclear power. As examples. And the question really is, how do you get over that? And the question, I think, rightly points to that problem, which is that we need to move beyond talking to just these larger companies. We need to look at the small, medium enterprises and the mid-tier suppliers that support these companies and their manufacturing.
So one of the outcomes from the ICE raid, the U.S. has, the State Department set up in Seoul a Korea investment desk. And I've been to that desk. And it's targeted for the large chaebols, the large conglomerates. But they quickly realized, the Hyundai, the ICE raid was a perfect example. A lot of those workers that got the 317 who were arrested and shackled, they were not employees of Hyundai or LG. They were suppliers, second or third tier suppliers. And so there's an awareness that we have to engage everyone. So now, as I understand it, the chaebols introduced their suppliers to the embassy that, look, these guys are working on this project, this, here, these dates, and that sort of gives them the credibility with the embassy to say, okay, good, you're good to go. Because, like every country, Korea, most of Korean employees come from the SMEs. So what you don't want is, nobody wants another repeat of that, the ICE raid.
I'll just briefly note that in the report, we did focus a little bit more heavily on the chaebols just because of the role that they play in Korea. But we are seeing mid-sized companies increasingly investing in the U.S. as well. We're seeing smaller Korean firms form supply agreements in battery cathodes and anodes, and we're seeing mid-sized Korean shipbuilders try to break into the naval maintenance and repair market as well.
And a lot of the chaebols bring their supply chain with them, so they're introducing all these companies as well.
결국 한국의 진짜 힘은 대기업 하나만이 아니라 그 뒤를 촘촘하게 받쳐주는 수많은 협력사들의 생태계에 있었습니다. 공장 하나를 옮기는 게 아니라 그 공장을 돌리게 만드는 공급망 전체를 함께 옮겨 심고 있는 셈인데요. 실력으로 존중을 끌어내고 이제는 없어서는 안 될 든든한 파트너가 된 우리 기업들의 행보를 보며 여러분은 어떤 생각이 드시나요? 오늘 영상을 보며 시청자 여러분들은 어떤 생각이 드셨나요? 오늘 영상은 여기까지입니다. 시청해주셔서 감사합니다.